The medic was crawling. He could hear the Kahl River below him, black water moving fast over rocks in the darkness, but he could not see it. He could not see anything. The fir trees above were so thick they blocked out the moon, and the trail beneath his hands was a soup of mud and frozen blood and something else, something soft that he did not want to think about. Somewhere behind him, a man was screaming. Not words, just sound. The kind of sound a man makes when his legs are gone and the morphine has worn off and nobody is coming. The medic kept crawling, his fingers closed around the boot of a dead soldier wedged between two rocks, and he pulled himself forward another yard. There were supposed to be litter bearers on this trail. There were supposed to be tanks. There was supposed to be a way out of this gorge, but the litter bearers were dead or lost. The tanks were stuck on a path 9 feet wide, with a cliff on one side and a ravine on the other, and the way out was crawling with German patrols who had retaken the town of Schmidt that morning and were now hunting the survivors in the dark. Other men were on this trail too. Soldiers without weapons, soldiers without helmets, soldiers carrying wounded men on litters fashioned from tree branches and overcoats because the real litters were gone. Some had smashed their radios so the Germans could not use them. Some had spiked their anti-tank guns and booby-trapped the last operational Sherman. They were not retreating in any organized sense. They were fleeing. As Charles MacDonald wrote in his account of the battle, like blind cattle, the men thrashed through the underbrush, all through the night and into the next day, frightened and fatigued, making their way across the icy Kahl in small, irregular groups, or alone. It was November 5th, 1944. The 28th Infantry Division had been in the Hürtgen Forest for 4 days. In that time, the division had suffered over 6,000 casualties. The 112th Infantry Regiment, which had crossed this gorge 2 days earlier with 2,200 men, now had roughly 300 left. Rifle companies that had started the attack with 150 soldiers were down to single digits. Every officer in some companies was dead or wounded. And the generals who had ordered this attack were not here in the gorge. They were in heated command posts miles behind the lines, already drafting orders for the next division to be fed into the same forest. This was not an ambush. This was not a surprise attack. This was the predictable result of a plan that should never have been approved, in a forest that should never have been attacked, in a campaign that the commanding general of the 12th Army Group, Omar Bradley, refused to stop, even as the evidence of catastrophe became impossible to ignore. The Hürtgen Forest is the longest single battle the American Army fought in World War II. It lasted from September 19, 1944 to February 10, 1945, nearly 5 months. In that time, the American Army fed roughly 120,000 soldiers into a 50-square-mile stretch of dark, dense German forest along the Belgian-German border, south of Aachen. The result was approximately 33,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, missing, captured, plus thousands more lost to trench foot, combat exhaustion, pneumonia, and exposure. Division after division went in, was ground to pieces, and was replaced by a fresh division that suffered the same fate. The 9th Infantry Division, the 28th, the 4th, the 8th, the 83rd, the 78th, the 2nd Ranger Battalion, elements of the 5th Armored Division. Each one was destroyed in the same dark woods against the same German defenders, for objectives that turned out to be either meaningless or achievable by other means. Carlo d'Este, one of the most respected military historians of the war, called the Hürtgen campaign the most ineptly fought series of battles of the war in the West. Rick Atkinson, in The Guns at Last Light, placed it alongside Operation Market Garden as one of the great debacles that punctuated the American advance. Charles MacDonald, who fought as a company commander in the forest and later became the Army's official historian, called it a misconceived and basically fruitless battle that should have been avoided. There is no dissenting view among serious scholars. The verdict is unanimous, and the man who bore the greatest share of command responsibility for it spent the rest of his life pretending it never happened. I think this is the most damning episode in Bradley's command record, not because he made the initial decision to attack, which had at least a thin military rationale, but because he refused to reconsider that decision as the evidence of catastrophe mounted week after week, division after division, until 33,000 Americans had bled for nothing. To understand how Bradley ended up pouring men into a dark forest for 5 months, you have to understand the moment. By September 1944, the Allied armies had crossed France at a speed that shocked even the optimists. Paris was liberated in August. The German army appeared to be collapsing. Eisenhower's headquarters was buzzing with talk that the war might end before Christmas, but the advance had outrun its supply lines. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition was rationed. And as the Americans reached the German border, they hit the Siegfried line, a belt of concrete fortifications, Dragon's Teeth tank obstacles, and prepared defensive positions stretching from Switzerland to the North Sea. The easy days were over. The Germans, fighting on their own soil now, stiffened. And it was in this moment of frustration, with victory seeming close but just out of reach, that Bradley approved an offensive into the worst terrain on the Western Front. To understand why it failed so completely, you have to understand the forest itself. Because the terrain was not incidental to the failure. It was the failure. The Hürtgen Forest covered 50 square miles of rugged hills and deep ravines straddling the German-Belgian border, between Aachen to the north and the Ardennes to the south. The trees were fir, planted in dense rows by German foresters, 75 to 100 feet tall, with a canopy so thick it blocked out daylight even at noon. Walking into the Hürtgen was like walking into a cathedral with the lights off. The forest floor was tangled with deadfall, brush, and roots. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles. 2 main ridgelines angled through the forest toward the Roer River to the east, separated by the Kahl River Gorge, a steep ravine with a single narrow trail clinging to its side. That trail would become the graveyard of the 28th Division. Roads through the forest were scarce, muddy, and primitive. Maps were in German, outdated and hard to read. American units entering the tree line frequently lost all sense of direction within minutes. The forest was also part of the Siegfried Line, Germany's western defense belt. Concrete bunkers sat at intersections and on high ground, reinforced with steel and covered with earth and pine needles until they were virtually invisible. Pillboxes studded the forest floor, camouflaged so well that American soldiers sometimes walked past them without realizing they were there until the firing started from behind. One engineer battalion working in the Huertgen lifted 1,352 mines, diffused 100 booby traps, and neutralized 125 pillboxes. And that was just one battalion in one sector. The minefields were among the worst American soldiers encountered anywhere in Europe. The Germans used shoe mines, small wooden boxes packed with explosive that could not be detected by metal detectors, buried just below the surface of the forest floor. They used bouncing betties, which sprang waist-high before detonating, designed to wound rather than kill because a wounded man takes more resources to evacuate than a dead one. Every path, every trail, every likely avenue of approach was seeded with these weapons. Soldiers learned to step only in the footsteps of the man ahead, and still men lost feet and legs with terrible regularity. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical. Men moved through the forest knowing that every step could be their last, that the ground itself was trying to kill them. Some units could hear the faint click of a mine being triggered and had just enough time to know what was about to happen. Others heard nothing. The German defenders exploited every advantage the terrain offered. The primary defending unit was the 275th Infantry Division, but over the course of the campaign, 37 different German units rotated through the Hürtgen. The Germans used small unit tactics perfectly suited to the forest. They would hold a position, force the Americans to deploy an assault, then pull back a few hundred yards to the next prepared line of bunkers and do it again. Every yard the Americans gained cost them casualties, and the next yard cost them more. The Germans also made ruthless use of pre-registered artillery. Every trail junction, every clearing, every logical assembly area in the forest had been plotted by German artillery observers. When American units gathered at a crossroad or paused to reorganize, the shells arrived within minutes. It was as if the forest itself was fighting on the German side. But the most lethal feature of the Hürtgen was what it did to the American Army's greatest weapon: artillery. In open terrain, American artillery dominance was devastating. Shells would explode on the ground or in the air, and soldiers in foxholes were relatively protected. In the Hürtgen, shells hit the treetops and exploded among the branches. The result was tree bursts, showers of steel fragments and wooden splinters raining straight down into foxholes that now offered no protection at all. German General Hans Schmidt reported that the effect of shells exploding in the treetops was far worse than in open ground because of the falling and splintering of trees and branches. Soldiers learned the terrible counterintuitive lesson that lying flat actually increased their exposure to tree bursts. Standing behind a thick trunk was safer. But there was no safe position in the Hürtgen. Ernest Hemingway, who was embedded with the 22nd Infantry Regiment, gave the forest its most famous description. He called it Passchendaele with tree bursts. Every single advantage the American Army possessed in 1944 was negated by this terrain. Armor could not maneuver. Tanks were confined to narrow, muddy trails, where a single disabled vehicle, a single felled tree, a single mine, could block an entire armored column for hours. Air power was useless because pilots could not see through the canopy and could not distinguish friendly positions from enemy positions, even when they could see the ground. Communications collapsed. Rain seeped into radios and shorted them out. Germans cut telephone wires. The dense canopy made compass navigation unreliable. Resupply was a nightmare. Getting hot food or ammunition to forward positions required carrying parties that themselves became targets. And here is what makes the decision to attack indefensible. None of this was a secret. The terrain was visible on any topographic map. The Siegfried Line defenses were known to Allied intelligence. The Germans had been preparing these positions since 1938. Yet, according to contemporary accounts, far behind the front lines at the headquarters of the American 12th Army Group, high-ranking officers drafted new attack plans, but no one really knew what the Hürtgen Forest looked like or what to expect in terms of opposition. The First Army went in with few detailed maps. A simple foot reconnaissance of the Call Trail would have revealed that it was 9 feet wide, exactly the width of a Sherman tank, with no room for error and no way to turn around if something went wrong. No such reconnaissance was conducted before the 28th Division was ordered to use it as its main supply route. If you're finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to the Hürtgen. The initial rationale for entering the forest came from Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding the 7th Corps. In September 1944, Collins was driving east toward Aachen, the first German city in the path of the Allied advance. He wanted to protect his right flank from a possible German counterattack out of the forest, and he ordered the 9th Infantry Division to push into the Hürtgen and clear the forest edge. The 9th Division's 39th, 47th, and 60th Infantry Regiments attacked into the trees on September 14th and immediately discovered what every subsequent division would learn the hard way. The forest swallowed them. Units lost contact with each other within hours of crossing the tree line. Platoons that were supposed to advance abreast drifted apart in the gloom, each one isolated, each one fighting its own separate war against an enemy it could hear but rarely see. The Germans did not try to hold every yard. They fought from prepared positions, inflicted casualties, and fell back to the next line of bunkers, drawing the Americans deeper into terrain that favored the defense at every turn. Artillery support was ineffective because forward observers could not identify targets through the canopy and could not maintain communication with the batteries behind them. Tanks sent to support the infantry bogged down on muddy trails or were stopped by felled trees that the Germans had cut across the roads. The 9th Division's attack became a series of small, vicious, disconnected firefights in which American soldiers died, taking bunkers that had no name and held no ground of any consequence. Over the next month, the 9th Division advanced approximately 3,000 yards, roughly a mile and a half. The cost was 4,500 casualties. That works out to 1.5 casualties for every single yard gained. Entire rifle companies were reduced to the strength of platoons. Replacement soldiers arrived at night and were dead or wounded by morning, never having learned the name of their unit or the face of their squad leader. By mid-October, the division was pulled out, exhausted, its infantry regiments shattered, its combat effectiveness destroyed. Here is where the decision becomes indefensible. After the 9th Division's failure proved beyond any reasonable doubt that the Hürtgen Forest was a meat grinder, the logical response was to stop, reassess, ask whether the forest could be bypassed, whether the flanking threat was real, whether the cost was proportional to any conceivable gain. Russell Weigley delivered the definitive answer to the flanking threat argument in Eisenhower's lieutenants. The most likely way to make the Hürtgen a menace to the American army, Weigley wrote, was to send American troops attacking into its depths. The cramped forest could not support the tank formations needed for a serious German counteroffensive. By attacking into the Hürtgen, Bradley was creating the very threat he claimed to be preventing. But Bradley and Hodges did not stop. They did not reassess. They sent in the 28th Infantry Division. Major General Norman Cota, commanding the 28th, was the same officer who had helped unstick the landings at Omaha Beach 5 months earlier. He was no coward and no fool. When he received his orders and studied the plan, he protested. The attack required his 3 regiments to advance on diverging axes toward 3 separate objectives, spread across miles of forest, violating the basic tactical principle of concentration of force. The 109th Infantry would push south. The 110th would attack through the center. The 112th would descend into the Call Gorge, cross the river, climb the far side, and capture the town of Schmidt. There was no division reserve. The Call Trail, which the 112th would depend on for resupply and tank support, had not been reconnoitered on foot. Cota told his superiors the plan had no more than a gambler's chance of success. 5th Corps Commander Major General Leonard Jarrow overruled him. The attack would proceed as ordered. On November 2nd, 1944, the 28th Division attacked. The 109th Infantry pushed south through dense forest toward the Germeter area. The 110th attacked through the center toward the villages of Siemensskal and Richelskal. And the 112th descended into the Call Gorge on a trail so narrow and steep that men slipped on wet rock and tumbled into the ravine below. For one day, against all odds, everything appeared to work. On November 3rd, lead elements of the 112th Infantry clambered up the far side of the Call Gorge and pushed into Schmidt, catching the German garrison completely by surprise. Soldiers found Germans eating lunch, riding bicycles, drinking schnapps. The town fell with minimal resistance. Reports raced back to higher headquarters. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commanding 1st Army, expressed himself extremely satisfied with the progress. Cota, caught up in the moment, later admitted he felt like a little Napoleon. It did not last 24 hours. That evening, the tank commanders who were supposed to bring armor forward to support the infantry and Schmidt attempted to drive Shermans down the Call trail. They discovered what a 10-minute foot patrol could have told them days earlier. The trail was 9 feet wide. A Sherman tank was 9 feet wide. There was a sheer rock wall on one side and a drop into the gorge on the other. One tank threw a track on a hairpin turn and blocked the entire route. Engineers worked through the night to clear it. By dawn on November 4th, only 5 tanks had made it across the Call, and 3 of those were soon knocked out. The 707th Tank Battalion would lose 31 of its 52 Shermans during the Schmidt operation. And then it got worse. At dawn on November 4th, the German counterattack hit Schmidt from 3 directions. Panthers and Mark IVs from the 116th Panzer Division came rolling out of the fog. A magnesium flare lit up the sky and revealed a long column of German armor snaking toward the town. The American infantry had 5 working tanks and no effective anti-tank defense. By 0830, a platoon on the eastern edge of town broke in panic. According to the after-action report, approximately 200 soldiers fled not west toward friendly lines, but east, deeper into German-held territory. Only 3 of them survived. By 10 in the morning, Schmidt was lost. The retreat across the Call Gorge became one of the worst episodes in American military history. Men who had crossed the Call in daylight now had to recross it in darkness, under fire, on a trail they could barely see. The trail itself was a death trap. Wrecked vehicles blocked the path. Dead mules that had been used to carry supplies lay where they had fallen, their loads scattered in the mud. The wounded who could not walk were left where they fell, propped against trees, calling out to anyone who passed. Some were carried on improvised litters made from branches and overcoats, 4 men struggling down a slope so steep that the litter bearers slipped and fell and had to start again. Others crawled on their hands and knees through the freezing mire, dragging shattered legs behind them. German infantry patrols worked the gorge throughout the night, and mortar fire rained down from the ridgelines above. The sound of the river mixed with the sound of wounded men and the occasional crack of a rifle as a German patrol found another group of stragglers. Some soldiers made it across the Call, only to discover they had no idea which direction led to friendly lines. The forest was featureless in the dark. Men wandered for hours, some walking in circles, some stumbling into German positions by accident. Small groups found each other and moved together, guided by nothing more than the vague sense that downhill led to the river, and the other side of the river led to safety. Of more than 2,000 soldiers who had fought east of the Call, barely 300 came back. The rest were dead, wounded, captured, or simply lost in a forest that had swallowed them whole. What happened next should have ended careers. On November 5th, Hodges arrived at Coda's command post. According to Rick Atkinson's account in The Guns at Last Light, Hodges berated Coda, then rounded on Jarrow in what Collins later recalled as the toughest dressing down he had ever witnessed, tougher than he had ever heard Hodges before. 3 days later, Eisenhower himself visited. He surveyed the wreckage of the 28th Division, turned to Coda, and said with a shrug, "Well, Dutch, looks like you got a bloody nose." After Eisenhower left, Hodges gave Coda yet another tongue-lashing and told Jarrow there may be some personnel changes made. Coda was eventually relieved. He became the scapegoat for a disaster created by the generals above him, who had approved the plan, ignored the terrain, and overruled his objections. By November 14th, the 28th Infantry Division had suffered 6,184 combat casualties, add 738 trench-foot cases, and 620 evacuations for battle fatigue, and the total approached 7,500 men in 12 days. The 112th Infantry Regiment alone lost over 2,000 men, 64% of its assigned strength. Every rifle company officer was killed or wounded. This is the part the official histories gloss over. After the 9th Division failed and the 28th Division was destroyed, Bradley still did not stop. He sent in the 4th Infantry Division. The 4th entered the forest on November 16th as part of Operation Queen, a broad offensive aimed at reaching the Roer River. The 22nd Infantry Regiment had landed at Utah Beach on D-Day and fought across France without being broken. The Huertgen broke it. Ernest Hemingway embedded with Colonel Charles Lanham in the 22nd, and what he witnessed over the next 3 weeks haunted him for the rest of his life. Over 18 days, the 22nd Infantry lost 2,678 men, advancing 6,000 yards. That is roughly 1 American casualty for every 2 yards gained. All 3 battalion commanders were killed or wounded within the first 3 days. The regiment was being consumed faster than it could be reinforced. One rifle company started the battle with 162 men. Over the course of the fighting, as replacements arrived and were themselves killed or wounded before they learned the terrain or the names of the men around them, the company suffered 287 total casualties, a rate of 167%. The officer turnover rate in rifle companies exceeded 300%. Platoon leaders lasted hours, not days. The men who survived the first week were leading squads full of strangers who had arrived that morning and would be gone by nightfall. There was no time to integrate replacements, no time to teach them the hard lessons the veterans had learned about tree bursts and mine patterns and how to read the forest. They arrived, they fought, and most of them were carried out or buried where they fell. Hemingway, who had seen combat in Spain and had waded ashore on D-Day, was shaken by what he witnessed with the 22nd. The forest reduced war to its most primitive form. There was no grand maneuver, no sweeping advance, no sense that ground gained today connected to a larger purpose. There were only trees and mud and the sound of shells detonating in the canopy overhead, and the steady attrition of men who deserved better than to die in a fight that their commanding generals could not explain. The 12th Infantry Regiment of the 4th Division fared no better. It lost 1,600 men in 9 days of fighting so confused and close-quartered that at times American and German soldiers were firing at each other from opposite sides of the same fallen tree. Meanwhile, the 8th Infantry Division was ordered to capture the town of Hürtgen itself. The town fell on November 28th and 29th after block-by-block fighting through rubble and burning buildings, but the division suffered over 6,000 casualties in the process. The town had no strategic value whatsoever. But that was just the beginning of the worst of it. In early December, the 2nd Ranger Battalion received orders to take Hill 400, a steep, wooded height overlooking the town of Bergstein. The hill dominated the surrounding terrain, and its capture was considered essential to any further advance. On December 7th, the Rangers attacked uphill through direct fire from dug-in German positions, seized the summit in a furious assault, and then held it for 2 days against repeated counterattacks supported by artillery and mortar fire, so intense that the hilltop looked like a moonscape by the time they were relieved. The battalion suffered approximately 90% casualties. Lieutenant Leonard Lommel, the same ranger who had scaled the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc on D-Day, called December 7th on Hill 400, the longest and most miserable day on Earth during his past 75 years. Rangers who survived both D-Day and Hill 400 said without hesitation that the Huertgen was worse. What the soldiers experienced in that forest went beyond the boundaries of what human beings were designed to endure. Technical Sergeant George Morgan of the 22nd Infantry described the conditions plainly. The forest up there was a hell of an eerie place to fight, he said. You cannot get all of the dead because you cannot find them, and they stay there to remind the guys advancing as to what might hit them. You cannot get protection. You cannot see. You cannot get fields of fire. Artillery slashes the trees like a scythe. Everything is tangled. You can scarcely walk. Everybody is cold and wet, and the mixture of cold, rain, and sleet keeps falling. Then they jump off again, and soon there's only a handful of the old men left. Trenchfoot reached epidemic proportions. After soldiers crouched for days in freezing mud without dry socks, without hot food, without any prospect of relief, their feet would swell until they resembled grotesque red balloons and burned as if immersed in battery acid. Medics peeled away dead flesh in strips. The worst cases required amputation. The 84th Division, which entered the forest later in the campaign, lost 500 men to trench foot alone, soldiers who were never touched by enemy fire but could no longer walk. A British observer who visited the American lines noted that commanders showed apparent indifference to the physical needs of their men. No rotation schedule, no organized system for delivering dry socks to the front, no regular hot meals. Combat exhaustion rates in the Huertgen were the highest of any American battle in the European theater. The constant artillery, the tree bursts that came without warning, the inability to see the enemy, the cold, the wet, the unburied dead lying along every trail, the knowledge that the man who had been beside you yesterday was gone today, and the man beside you now would be gone tomorrow. It broke men. Some shot themselves in the foot or hand to get evacuated. Some simply stopped functioning. One replacement arrived at a ranger position and saw a fellow soldier's head blown completely off at a distance of 3 feet. He immediately became speechless. He could not recall his own name. He could not recognize the men around him. He ended up in a psychiatric ward in the United States and never returned to the war. Combat medic Jacob Brusser called the Huertgen the worst battle the American Army fought in World War II in the European theater. He said it was hell on earth. He also witnessed something that spoke to a shared humanity beneath the killing. On several occasions, German and American soldiers established informal truces to bring their wounded to aid stations. Men who had been trying to kill each other minutes earlier carried stretchers together through the trees. It was a decency that the generals directing the campaign from their heated headquarters had failed to extend to their own troops. Here is where the entire strategic justification for the campaign collapses. After the war, Bradley needed an explanation for why he had sent 120,000 Americans into a forest that killed or maimed 33,000 of them. The flank protection rationale that Collins had originally offered was obviously insufficient to justify 5 months of slaughter, so Bradley constructed a new narrative. It was about the Roer River dams. 2 massive dams, the Schwammenau and the Urft, sat on the upper Roer River on the eastern edge of the forest. If the Germans opened those dams while American forces were crossing the Roer downstream, the resulting flood could trap and destroy entire divisions on the far bank. Bradley claimed in his later writings that by mid-October 1944, we were very much aware of the threat they posed, and that the whole point of fighting through the Hürtgen was to gain control of the dams and spillways. Rick Atkinson's Pulitzer Prize-winning research in The Guns at Last Light proved this was untrue. The documentary record tells a very different story. Not until November 7, 1944, after more than 10,000 American casualties had already been suffered in the forest, did Hodges order 5th Corps to begin planning to seize the dams. Not until December 4th, after the 28th and 4th Divisions had been destroyed and the 8th Division mauled, did Bradley's own war diary contain the entry, decided must control Roer Dam. Collins himself, the general who started the entire campaign, later admitted the failure plainly. "We had not studied that particular part of the zone," he said. "That was an intelligence failure, a real combat intelligence failure. I believe this is the most damning evidence against Bradley. Not just that he made a costly decision, but that he fabricated a justification after the fact to cover a campaign that had no coherent strategic purpose when it was launched. He was not fighting for the dams. He was fighting because he had started fighting and could not bring himself to stop." And then there is the memoir. In 1951, Bradley published A Soldier's Story, his account of the war. He completely omitted the Battle of Hürtgen Forest. Not a chapter, not a page, not a single sentence. The longest battle fought on German soil in World War II, costing 33,000 American casualties under his direct command authority, and he wrote about it as if it never happened. I think that silence is more revealing than any post-war rationalization. Bradley knew the Hürtgen was indefensible, so he chose to erase it. The dams were finally captured in February 1945. The 78th Infantry Division and the 82nd Airborne Division took Schmidt on February 7th and 8th, nearly 5 months after the first American soldiers had tried to reach it, and seized the Schwamenau and Orff dams on February 9th. The irony was bitter. The dams that had been ignored for months, that Bradley would later claim had been the objective all along, fell in a matter of days once the right forces were committed with a clear plan. The 78th Division took Schmidt in 2 days of fighting. The 28th Division had been destroyed trying to do the same thing 3 months earlier with a worse plan, inadequate support, and no understanding of the terrain. But even this late success was hollow. By the time the dams were in American hands, the Germans had already opened the discharge valves on the Schwamenau, flooding the Roer Valley and delaying the Allied crossing by 2 weeks. The water level rose slowly and steadily, turning the Roer into an impassable barrier without the dramatic, catastrophic flood that the Americans had feared, but creating a tactical delay that accomplished the same purpose. The flooding would have occurred regardless of whether Americans had fought through the forest or bypassed it entirely. 5 months, 33,000 casualties, and the one objective that actually mattered was achieved only after the Germans had already rendered it partially irrelevant, and the cost extended beyond the Hürtgen itself. The divisions mauled in the forest were sent to quiet sectors of the Ardennes to rest and rebuild. When the German counteroffensive struck on December 16, 1944, the 28th Infantry Division was sitting directly in the path of the assault, still under strength, still broken from the Hürtgen. Bradley himself acknowledged this connection in his later writings. "Had we secured the dams early in November and pushed across the Roer," he wrote, "the enemy would never have dared counterattack us in the Ardennes." He was admitting that his own failure at the Hürtgen helped create the conditions for the Battle of the Bulge. Even the German High Command was baffled by what Bradley was doing. Major General Rudolf von Gersdorf, 7th Army Chief of Staff, reported after the war that the German command could not understand the reason for the strong American attacks in the Hürtgen Forest. The fighting in the wooded area denied the American troops the advantages offered them by their air and armored forces. The Germans had expected the Americans to bypass the forest, to use their mobility and air superiority to maneuver around it and strike at the Roer crossings from open ground to the north or south. When the Americans instead attacked head-on into the worst possible terrain, the German defenders could hardly believe their luck. A captured German document assessed American performance in the forest and concluded that, in combat in wooded areas, the American showed himself completely unfit. Atkinson, quoting this assessment, noted that, harsh as that judgment was toward the common American soldier, it had a whiff of legitimacy with respect to American generalship. The soldiers were not unfit, their generals were. So who bears responsibility for this catastrophe? Bradley, as commanding general of the 12th Army Group, approved and sustained the offensive from September through February. He failed to ensure proper intelligence analysis of the terrain and the Roer dam system. He failed to question the assumptions underlying the campaign when the 9th Division's failure should have prompted a fundamental reassessment. He allowed the attack to continue through 5 divisions without a change in strategy. And after the war, he lied about his reasoning and then omitted the battle entirely from his first memoir. But I want to be fair. because this channel does not do hit jobs any more than it does hero worship. Bradley was not an incompetent general. His planning for the Normandy breakout at St. Lo was superb. His management of the 12th Army Group across France was, in many respects, the most complex operational and logistical achievement of the American Army in Europe. He earned the trust of his soldiers and the respect of Eisenhower. He deserves credit for those accomplishments. And what the Hürtgen reveals is not that Bradley lacked ability. It reveals that he was stubborn, that he operated within a command culture that discouraged questioning from below, and that he lacked the moral courage to admit when a decision was wrong and reverse course even as the body count climbed into the tens of thousands. Hodges bears at least equal blame. The First Army commander was, in Atkinson's assessment, the wrong general for the job. By late 1944, Hodges was mentally exhausted, prone to micromanagement, and unwilling to visit the front lines where his decisions were playing out in blood. He created a command atmosphere of fear and recrimination. He sacked 10 of 13 corps and division commanders relieved in the 12th Army Group during the war, creating what Atkinson described as inordinate caution that suppressed both initiative and drive throughout First Army. When subordinates like Coda raised concerns, they were overruled. When the results were disastrous, the subordinates were punished. Wegley identified a deeper structural problem. Hodges drew a specious historical analogy between the Hürtgen and the Hürtgen Forest in 1918, when an uncleared forest had threatened the American advance in the First World War. That comparison, Wegley wrote, received little critical scrutiny within First Army, not least because of reluctance to challenge Hodges. This is the real command failure. Not a single bad decision on a single day, but a system that prevented bad decisions from being questioned, corrected, or reversed. The men who knew the plan was flawed were silenced. The men who could have stopped the bleeding did not look closely enough to see it. There's also the question of why Eisenhower did not intervene. As Supreme Commander, he had the authority and the responsibility to halt any operation he judged to be wasteful. He visited the Hürtgen in November. He saw the condition of the 28th Division. He told Coda he had gotten a bloody nose, and then he left. He did not order a halt. He did not demand a reassessment. In my view, Eisenhower's failure here was not active, but passive. He trusted Bradley. He deferred to his ground commanders on tactical decisions, and that deference, which served him well in most circumstances, cost lives in the Hürtgen because the ground commanders he was deferring to had lost their way. I think the most important lesson of the Hürtgen is not about tactics or terrain or even about Omar Bradley specifically. It is about what happens when generals stop listening and start doubling down. Every fresh division sent into the forest after the 9th Division failed was not a new strategic initiative. It was a refusal to accept that the first decision was wrong. It was institutional momentum dressed up as strategy. It was pride measured in American lives. And the fact that no senior officer was held accountable, that Bradley went on to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs and a 5-star general while the men who died in the Hürtgen were forgotten, tells you something about how the American military processed its failures in World War II, which is to say, it often did not process them at all. The numbers tell the final story. 33,000 American casualties by conservative count, with some historians placing the total as high as 55,000 when all non-battle losses are included. 88 days of main combat, a 2-to-1 casualty ratio favoring the Germans, reversing the normal American advantage in every other major campaign in Europe. The longest single battle fought on German soil, 7 divisions chewed up and spat out. And the commanding general who ordered it all wrote a 467-page memoir about the war and did not mention it once. Major General James Gavin of the 82nd Airborne, whose division finally captured the dams 5 months after the first Americans entered the forest, delivered the verdict that every serious historian has since endorsed. In retrospect, he said, it was a battle that should not have been fought. Edward Miller, in the definitive account, A Dark and Bloody Ground, called it one of the bloodiest and most disastrous campaigns of World War II, and emphasized that for weeks, without a clear-cut reason for attacking through the forest, American commanders nevertheless ordered units of as many as 7 divisions into the woods to be chewed up. Max Hastings blamed a fatal combination of unimaginative command decisions by Bradley and Hodges. MacDonald, who had been there, who had seen it, who had survived it, could only call it misconceived and fruitless. Colonel David Hackworth, one of the most decorated American soldiers of the 20th century, endorsed Miller's account and called Huertgen one of the most costly blunders of World War II. The battle has no monument in the American consciousness. There's no Hürtgen Forest memorial on the National Mall. No Hollywood film has told the story. Bradley's omission of it from his memoir set the pattern. The Hürtgen became the forgotten battle, overshadowed by the Normandy invasion before it and the Battle of the Bulge after it. But the men who fought there did not forget, and the forest did not forget. Decades after the war, hikers walking the Cowell Trail still found helmets, shell fragments, and the rusted remains of equipment half buried in the soil. The trees grew back, the bunkers remained. The soldiers who fought in the Hürtgen Forest, the men who called it the Death Factory, deserved better than what their generals gave them. They deserved commanders who understood the terrain they were ordering men into. They deserved a command structure that could admit a mistake and change course before the cost became unbearable. They deserved to be remembered honestly, not erased from the memoir of the man who sent them there. As General Thorson of First Army Operations admitted after the war, all we could do was sit back and pray to God that nothing would happen. It was a horrible business, the forest. We had the bear by the tail and we just could not turn loose. 33,000 Americans paid the price for that refusal to let go.